Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Spanning 13 years, 2 continents, several wars, and many smoldering, blood-soaked battlefields, John Sayles' new novel is a thrilling, historical, and cinematic epic. Jamie MacGillivray, The Renegade's Journey. It begins in the heat of a vicious war at the Battle of Culloden in Scotland in 1746, the last desperate stand of Bonnie Prince Charlie, pretender to the British throne. The novel follows Jamie and Jenny Ferguson, a poor young woman swept up on false charges in the wake of Culloden, through servitude, revolt, escape, recapture, guerrilla warfare, and romantic entanglements. John Sayles is a much-celebrated film director who has made 18 movies such as 8 Men Out, City of Hope, Passion Fish, and Lone Star, the last 2 of which earned him Academy Award nominations for Best Original Screenplay. As an author, he has written numerous novels and short stories since 1975, when his first novel, Pride of the Bimbos, appeared. Subsequent novels and story collections include At the Anarchist Convention, Dillinger in Hollywood, A Moment in the Sun, and Yellow Earth. Before a live audience at the White Hart Inn in Salisbury, Connecticut, please join me in welcoming John Sayles. I've heard this story told a couple different ways, but how ultimately did this tale land in your lap?
Over 20 years ago, I got a call from the Scots actor Robert Carlyle, who I didn't know and he didn't know me. I'd been recommended to him as a screenwriter. And he said, I have this great idea for a movie, and it is about a Highland Scot who's involved with the Jacobite rebellion. He's defeated at the Battle of Culloden, taken prisoner, and instead of hanging him at the last minute, they decide to transport him to the New World, and he gets involved with the Indians there. And I just really liked the idea of the story, and on spec wrote a screenplay, and then Robert liked it, and Maggie Renzi and I got to join him and scout the Highlands of Scotland together, and then we scouted a bunch of other locations for a movie in the Georgia, Florida area, up in wilds of Canada, Pennsylvania woods, and never could raise the money to make the movie. So some 20 years later, I just felt like, it's such a good story. I got to do something with it, and started looking into, what would happen if I expanded it, which always happens when you're taking a 2-hour movie and making it into a novel. And what happens is you do a little more research, and some of the minor characters get to be major characters, and it gets fat.
But not your longest novel.
No. My novel, A Moment in the Sun, is over 1,000 pages, so this is nothing. And because I now mostly write on a computer and I don't print anything out, there isn't that pile of paper growing every day. So I don't count until I feel like it's over. And then it just I was so relieved it was only a little over 700 pages.
Was Jenny one of the characters that got expanded?
Yeah, Jenny Ferguson was a minor character in the original screenplay. And when I started doing some of the deeper research, I discovered that I could find the transcripts of the voyages of some of the ships that the prison ships that brought people over as transported convicts to basically be slaves in the New World. And one of them that had Jacobite men as well as women on it, just before it got to Jamaica to turn people out in the cane fields as slaves, was taken by a French privateer, and the people were liberated on the island of Martinique. And I figure, here's Jenny, who's this very poor girl. She's been barefoot most of her life. A good meal is like oatmeal with some cow blood in it for the protein. And she's never been anywhere. She's illiterate but really smart and really adventurous and curious. And all of a sudden, she's getting French food, and there's mangoes and warm weather, and things are looking up. And a French lieutenant, what the heck.
In that process, do the early trips that you took in scouting scenes, does that become research?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's great to have been. I've been everywhere that appears in the book except Martinique, and I'm hoping to go there someday. But yeah, you've seen the place. You have an idea what the landscape is like. You can imagine yourself into it. You have to imagine yourself into different kinds of weather, of course. And then you talk to people who really know the story, and you get a feel for that.
You think of what 2+ hours is on the page, and obviously this is a large novel. So that seems to me like it would be tremendously freeing.
Yeah, I mean, what happens in a screenplay is you make big jumps, big time jumps, and big place jumps. And in this, because Jenny and Jamie aren't often together, sometimes they're on different continents, you can kind of cut between them, cross-cut between them. So you're making geographic jumps, but you're not taking the time jumps that you would in a movie. You know, one of the biggest differences between writing a screenplay and making a movie and writing a novel is time. When you're writing a screenplay, I know people don't all watch things this way. It's meant to be, okay, people are going to sit down for 2 hours and they're going to watch this movie. And so you have to be aware of, am I 15 minutes into the movie? Am I a half hour? Is this the exciting climax? Things better be speeding up and coming to a conclusion. In a book that's over about 250 pages, you've got time to walk around in it. You're not going to sit down and read it in one sitting.
No, but with that said, there's just glorious pacing in this novel. You have a stop-start, right? You can go back and forth, as you said. Yeah,
and also, I try to have the sections have their own arc. Just as you're thinking of a viewer when you're making a movie, I'm thinking of a reader of, well, maybe you've only got the energy at night to read 15 pages. Well, a lot of these are 15 pages or less, and you feel satisfied by that story about that character who you may have met before. You do have to, when you get this long, you have to think about, oh, geez, we haven't seen this character for 200 pages. Maybe I have to remind people subtly who this person is.
Yeah.
And oh, yeah, that guy. Yeah.
Sometimes they do that with a cast of characters. You didn't do that.
Yeah, sometimes you do it, if it's big enough, you have it so people can go back. In a movie,
seems like it's cheating.
Oh, there's Charlie Sheen again.
The name of the new novel is Jamie MacGillivray, The Renegade's Journey, and it is published by Melville House. Does the director's sensibility ever enter into the writing process, or is it just naturally entwined?
For me, what director means is that you're directing other people's talents, people who have talents you don't have. So when I write, direct, and edit a movie, the part that's the most collaborative is when I'm directing. And I'm talking to production designers, and I'm talking to composers, and I'm talking to actors. And so it's not just me. It's like, let's try to do this thing and see where it goes. And then give me 3 choices, and I'll pick the best one. But I'm going to not make those 3 choices. So while I'm writing, I'm really writing, and when I'm editing, I'm still writing. I'm rewriting, basically. While I'm directing, I'm working with other people. So actually, there's a lot of editing in this, and there's a lot of writing in it, and a lot of thinking in it, and a lot of research in it, but not really a whole lot of directing.
Are you a fast writer?
Yeah, I am fast. I'm lucky in that once I carried this around for 20 years, so it should have been a snap. But yeah, when my rule, especially with these novels that have a lot of research to them, is I'm allowed 1 week of research, and then I have to sit down and write some fiction. And that way, you just keep your momentum going. You're going to end up with some gaps while you're writing that next section, and you're going to have to go back and fill in some usually small details, but you've done enough research that you feel like, okay, I'm talking about the debtors' prisons where they held these prisoners before they transported them to the New World. Well, Dickens' father was in a debtors' prison. He's written about them. Quite a bit has been written about them. You might do a week's research on where were they, how were they being run in the time that the Jacobites were there. What was the food like? What were the rules? What were the rules that were broken by the people who were running them? And then you sit down and you write it, and you keep your momentum going. When you're done with that, then you can go and do a little research about the next section that you're going to do.
There's a Dickensian vibe to this.
Mm-hmm.
Are you reading Dickens before, during, both?
Yeah, both. I mean, sometimes just for a break. I had never read a lot of Dickens. I had seen movies made based on this stuff, but I read quite a bit of Dickens. I read Robert Louis Stevenson, who's writing about 100 years later, but he's very familiar with the Highland stories. I'm plowing my way through Sir Walter Scott. There's a lot of dialect in this, but his is, really gumbo. It's really pretty thick. I read quite a bit of Fielding. Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones, ends up being a character here. He was a satirist who hadn't written novels yet, but very anti-Jacobite. And eventually he became the police chief of London. And a guy named Tobias Smollett. So people who were writing at the time to get a feel for the language, for what was considered the sense of humor, for the attitudes of the time. And that's just kind of a nice vacation, because it's also, they're good books. So.
Well, and there's times in this novel where it comes like it's a well-written comedy skit.
Yeah, and certainly the one I read with Cruikshank and Rigby, that's kind of Kipling married to Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. But I was thinking of, my father was in World War II, and, he used to have these old cartoons from Yank magazine, and Bill Malden, who was a great cartoonist, had these Willie and Joe characters. And, it's just, there's always these guys who are just the foot soldiers, and they usually have a kind of gallows humor, because they don't know where they're going next, and they're not supposed to know. They're just supposed to do it. And in those days in the British Army, they were mostly barely educated, working to poor guys. It was the best job they could get. They might have been shanghaied into it. And they're cannon fodder, and they know it.
The 13 years that you cover is fairly well defined, right? You knew that going in of what that was going to be.
Yeah, it always in the screenplay, it starts at the Battle of Culloden and ends at the Battle of Quebec.
Does that make it, not that any of this is easy, but does that make it easier to be able to say, okay, this is where I know where I'm going? Yeah,
it gives you a great chronological structure to hang everything on, so you can start to think of, where do I want my character to be when this happens? What we call the French and Indian War starts up kind of in the middle of that. So George Washington is a character. And I didn't start this thinking, I'm gonna make George Washington a character. It's just there were fewer people in the world back then. There were a lot fewer people who weren't native people in the New World. And if you're on the frontier, you're going to run into George Washington. He's a big, tall guy. He's very ambitious. He's a surveyor. He's in your backyard with his surveying stuff. And there's George Washington again. So he was kind of unavoidable, as were some of the other historical characters.
Talk about that being unavoidable, of bumping in, because there are moments of the history that you're writing that it just seems inevitable that you're going to have to address these moments.
Yeah, well, what happens with Jamie is that when we meet him, he's already kind of a linguist. It's not his job, but he speaks Scots Gaelic, he speaks Erse, he speaks Scots, he speaks English, accented. He speaks French because he's a go-between for the Jacobites, where the Jacobites in exile in France were planning this invasion. He even speaks a little Latin because he's taken a couple of years of law in Edinburgh. So when he gets to the New World and escapes the people he was originally sold to and is captured by the Lenni Lenape, who we call the Delaware Indians, he realizes, if I'm going to survive, I better learn their language. I better, I better know what they're saying about me and about other things. So very slowly, he learns that language. And so eventually what happens is the Lenni Lenape, are faced with a situation. Well, we're trading with the English, we're trading with the French. It looks like they're going to have a war. They want us to join one side or the other. What do you think? And you have to be our translator. And he's trusted enough by that time that he becomes their translator. And of course, he's got a few prejudices against the English.
So he's come to the New World, and not that great.
Well, not if you're a slave.
Right.
Nowhere is that great if you're
Right.
enslaved. And then he didn't come, as an indentured servant, hoping to serve a few years and then be freed. He came, to be a prisoner for the term of his natural life. He has a couple days of freedom, and then he's captured again. And he could be a prisoner of the Lenni Lenape for the term of his natural life, but events eventually make him valuable to them. And when he has a choice to betray them, he doesn't, and they know it. And eventually he says, "Oh, they're going to kill English people. I'm down with that," and he becomes somebody else. Jenny has to go through this thing where, she thinks are they going to hang me? Are they going to, send me as a slave somewhere? Then this opportune thing happens where, she's freed, sort of, on the island of, Martinique. And for a woman, survival is always very different than survival is for a man. And so she immediately has to say, okay, I need a protector. And here I'm working for this French lieutenant. And, I'm learning Creole French from his slaves. And he says my French is atrocious, and he's going to teach me how to speak proper French, starting with the body parts. So she's trying to survive. She's having a better time than she would back at home, bleeding the cow for dinner. But she's just trying to get through the day very often. And because she's smart, she learns French pretty quickly and then has to adapt to various other things.
John Sayles is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new novel is Jamie MacGillivray, A Renegade's Journey. My understanding, and I think I've talked to you about this before, but your love of diaries, of reading diaries and understanding the thoughts of those that you write about.
Yeah, diaries and letters. I think people are less guarded when they think there's something private about it. And you get quite a few of those, with the people who are educated enough to write. You get to read some of George Washington's letters to his various friends from that period. You get to read other British officers' letters and diaries who were on that campaign. I read French well enough with a dictionary nearby that I could read accounts by French people who went to Martinique in the 1750s, and it was totally new to them. And they're writing back about, God, you wouldn't believe this place. This is incredible. And then others who are going to Canada in the middle of the winter saying, God, you wouldn't believe this place. It's freezing. They called it the ice box.
Yes.
And many of the people who were supposed to be protecting it from the English just wanted to lose quickly and go home.
I'm not giving anything away here, but you put these characters through the ringer.
Yeah, it was a tough time. Life is pretty elemental,
Yes.
even if you're not at war. You got to live through a winter. There's not always enough to eat. That's tough enough. Then you add this proxy war that these two European powers are having, and one of the things that I wanted to get into in the book is two things, which is the way that I was taught. If you just kind of skim the surface like they did with the French and Indian War, you had this idea of these somewhat civilized people who had golden chalices and laws and wigs and all this stuff came over, and then there were these almost naked people who cut your hair off and tortured you. Really reading this, the question should be, okay, who are the savages here? The bloody law is still what's going on in England, and you don't have to do much to end up getting cut in 4 pieces and all kinds of awful stuff leading up to that. And also the politics of Europe at that time. At one point, Jamie, for his fellow inmates, breaks down what's going on with the Austrian succession, which is so complicated that everybody's just heads are swimming at the end of it. But that's what's happening. Their king is also the Elector of Hanover, and somehow he's got a vote for who the Holy Roman Empire is, and people are killing each other off over this. Well, you go to the New World, and the economics and the politics of the native tribes here are just as complicated. And that's something that Jamie doesn't know until he gets to know the tribe. And it's just like, oh my God, well, there's the Iroquois Confederacy, and they kind of lorded over the Lenni Lenape because of a battle they won years ago. And the Shawnee have to stay nomadic. And then other people, we can pay them to go down their river, but the other people will kill us if they go down the river. There was this Lenni Lenape, saying of, you can't be neutral in the woods. You have to stand on one side of the tree or the other. And that's a lot of what's hard about this is, you just want to hunt your deer, grow your crops, whatever, and all of a sudden there's this proxy war going on, and you've got to take sides.
I'm hoping you will read to us a short section of the book in which we meet Lachlan. This is after the battle.
They didn't kill everybody, so they had a bunch of prisoners. Kind of your fate depended on luck and your station in life. And the character you're going to meet here is Lachlan, who ends up being a kind of co-escapee with Jamie eventually. And Lachlan is a Shanachie, a bard, and his mission in life is to improvise verses to amuse and celebrate his clan brethren and his lords. And he is just out of this sponge house where they've been wondering, what are they going to do with us? What are they going to do with us? And he's about to get the word. They are mustered in the yard facing the king's bench, joining the Jacobite prisoners from there, as well as 50 more brought over from the new jail, prodded into rows and their names taken. Lachlan is behind the enormous MacGregor, whose Christian name is Fergal, and thus finds it difficult to see what their captors are up to in the front. Fergal seems to have remained a bit cracked since his ordeal shackled to the corpse. Something in his eye, the way he mutters constantly to himself. The MacGillivray brothers and Aeneas Cameron have been left behind, not being gentlemen or men of estates, but above common men, and therefore destined for the more particular attentions of the crown, with Jamie fairly treading on the tiger's tail by demanding his own day in court. This ceremony, however, is in the charge of a glowering hulk of a lieutenant, nose in the air as if detecting a foul odor as he explains to the body of prisoners. As your name is called, he announces, you will step forward and draw one slip of paper from a hat containing many. If you receive a paper with a black ball scribed upon it, you will be separated from your fellows, appointed for trial, and almost certainly hanged for your transgression. If you receive a blank paper, you will be allowed to petition for the king's mercy without trial and suffer transportation from this realm. In their many idle hours, this second possibility has been much commented on, with horrible stories of slavers' whips on steamy tropical plantations, or mutilation and death at the hands of Red Indians, circulated by men who have heard, though none has ever been there nor met a living transport. Lachlan, born on an island, hopes that whatever new situation he might be brought to will be near the sea. I might add, continues the lieutenant, that we have arranged the papers so that roughly 1 out of every 20 of you shall be held to trial. You are in the hands of Providence. A sergeant begins to call out names, prisoners stepping forward to reach into the capacious, fur-trimmed bonnet that Whipshaw from the Marshalsea prison has volunteered, each pulling out a scrap of paper, glancing at it quickly, then handing it to a clerk standing behind a barrelhead that has been set up for his list-keeping. Lachlan bends around Big Fergal to see, as the fourth man called is pulled aside by the sergeant after surrendering his paper. Ferguson, Alexander, the clerk intones, scratching pen to ledger. Blackballed. Pell-mell ye rushed the battle, as their volleys rent the air, thinks Lachlan. A ball was meant to kill you, but it missed you by a hair. So sure, the laird had spared you. You left that bloody stage with no idea that fatal ball awaits you on a page. There is shelter in verse, distance. The noble phrases dulling the sound of flesh hacked by steel, the cries of men, the sudden deadly shriek of wayward artillery. To sit and observe from a height. You've gained your all for Scotland, survived the final stand. Such reckless acts of valour should be named throughout the land. But one man at 20 will dangle by the neck, condemned now by a drop of ink, no bigger than a speck. MacLeod, Lachlan, reads the sergeant from his list. Lachlan steps forward. There are 3 men in the condemned line already, and he tries to calculate his chances, closing his eyes to reach into Whipshaw's beaver hat. He opens them to see the verdict. The paper is blank, blank as a clear summer sky over Raasay Island. Lachlan smiles as the final verse forms in his head. A sky that bodes fair weather, that exudes a healing light. No black mark clouds the future, no defiles the virgin white. Like westward flocks, wind-driven, but times will blithely soar, till time and fate deposit us on which benighted shore.
John Sayles' new novel is Jamie MacGillivray, A Renegade's Journey. It is published by Melville House. Our thanks to the White Hart Inn in Salisbury, Connecticut, and Oblong Books in Millerton and Rhinebeck, New York. oblongbooks.com. Thanks to producer Sarah LeDuc. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock. The latest on national production programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at WAMC.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for